able to do what the US has so credibly been able to do for the last half century, which is to influence events half a globe away, even conducting military actions far away from their homeland, affecting the fates of governments, changing governments in foreign countries. That kind of ruling the world, no one's going to be able to do it. The world has moved on.
So the whole way
no one may want to do it either.
So the whole way we're pitching this argument or debate, China versus India, is actually A, not very useful, and B, also irrelevant, is what you're saying.
Well, that's harsh on our organizers. It's an interesting question, but I agree with you, not a particularly useful one. For two reasons. First of all, I think that, that lovely little drawing they had of this cup, this trophy, being, tugged. There isn't a trophy. Frankly, what we're looking for, I think, is to see both countries doing well by their people, and thereby indirectly by the world. But secondly, if you even were to see a tug of war, that rope is so much over on the Chinese side that there really isn't a race anymore. It was a question one could have asked in, say, 76 to 78, when both countries had the same GDP, which meant in per capita terms, India was actually slightly ahead.
Whoa, hold on. So what you're saying is, if it were still considered a race, if the outcome is already predetermined?
Yeah, except that it's a race that I'm not keen on entering into.
Okay.
And I just don't think it's any more the same race.
All right.
The question was asked a lot in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, and it was legitimate to ask. It was asked very much in the context of democratic mixed economy development versus communist development. But the terms of the debate have changed completely. China is no longer, as I was saying to Martin a little earlier, a communist country in any meaningful sense of the term. Certainly in economics, it does not follow communist economics. And in any case, by 78, it started a process of liberalization, which took its economy growing much faster than India. And thanks to the magic of compounding, it's gone from being an economy on a par with India to being an economy about 5 times the size of India. It's absurd for us to think in terms of a race or a competition.
Okay.
But I asked myself, why should I want to compete with China? As long as my people are not starving, they can have 3 meals a day, decent work, better quality of life, let the Chinese people have it too. We're not in a race against each other. We're in a race for the same things.
Interesting. Okay, Dr. Jacques, let me bring you in, or Martin, rather. One of the premises of your book is, When China Rules the World, is at some stage, it's a question more of when as opposed to if China will overtake the United States to become the biggest economy in the world, number one. Correct? All right. Let me ask you now, though, with what China's been going through the last 2-3 years, the slowdown, worries about this debt bomb, worries about the rebalancing, worries about corruption as well. Does that push the time frame out further? Is there a number that you use when China will overtake the U.S., or is that even useful anymore, asking that?
Well, I've always resisted putting a date because, it's silly. It's not being serious. What's already we know is, according to the World Bank International Comparison Program, China overtook the size of the American economy by GDP, PPP, towards the end of 2014. That's what we know, in terms of a reasonably, objective assessment. But China is still behind the United States, significantly so, by GDP measured by exchange rates. But
per capita.
And per capita, Chinese living standards are less than a quarter of those of the United States. So to close that gap, we're talking about decades. We're not talking about in the near future. In terms of GDP by exchange rates, then I think China will overtake the United States within the next few years. And I think that's inevitable. I agreed with John Negroponte this morning. He said, it will happen. It's the figures.
Okay.
And so, but that in itself, it's not just about economics, is it? To become the hegemonic power, or whatever you want to call it, then you're talking about a range of metrics: political influence, cultural influence.
Frankly, let me ask you, does that include military?
Not yet, but I'm about to say military,
Okay.
ethical power, intellectual power. I mean, sometimes we use the term soft power to express some of this as well. Now, in those terms, that's much more difficult to measure because you can't have any really hard figures in relationship to this. And I think this takes time. This takes a lot of time. You know, when Britain rose to be the most important number one country in the early 19th century, it was still a long time before it became that sort of military, mainly naval, political, cultural power that it did become in the second half of the 19th century. Likewise, the United States. The United States became the world's largest economy.
Wouldn't it happen much faster today with China, though?
Yes, I think you have a point.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, just on the United States. United States was the largest economy in the world before the end of the 19th century. But we don't start talking about America as a global power until after 1945, really, but some elements of it in the 1930s. Now, true, it'll happen quicker. Why will it happen quicker? Well, partly because everything's speeded up, partly because the growth rates we're talking about now are much faster, and partly because China is so big. And that's also potentially the possibility for India as well.
Interesting. So the other premise of your book in terms of dominance, right, reflects China's economic power as well as cultural power. But I noticed that even though we're talking about it today, you didn't talk so much about it in your book, the military side of things. And let me turn to Shashi for that. From India's perspective, or maybe even your own personal perspective, how much does India fear China's resurgence?
Well, we have the world's longest unresolved frontier between us, and that dispute is one that for some decades we've been under the impression China doesn't want to settle. They seem to enjoy keeping it slightly alive so they can throw India off balance once in a while. I'm not sure fear is the word, though, because increasingly there's also been a perception that it can't be in the interests of anybody in China to go to war over that border again, as China did very successfully in 1962. And the lingering legacy of 62 in India is one not so much of fear, but of humiliation, frankly. We got clobbered. Whereas in China, I think it's indifference. I think the Chinese have forgotten it. They don't even remember, most of them, that they went to war with us. So there is this difference of perception. I would like to come to this further, but I want to quickly interject though on soft power. That's the one area where I disagree with Martin. I don't think that, in fact, China is doing well on soft power, despite assiduous efforts to promote it. Everything from the Beijing Olympics to the hundreds of Confucius centers around the world are an assiduous attempt to